Hello and welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. This is Benji, and this is the first episode of meta tips for duelists who are lazy, or duelists who just don't like to read. And what we're doing in this episode is we're going to go over all of the hand traps that affect the graveyard and determine which one is the best and why, and in certain scenarios of different matchups. If you're interested in seeing more meta tips in the future, make sure you click the subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment down below if there's something I miss. I am recording this live with no script, so there is a chance that I miss something. So today we're going to be focusing on 3 hand traps in particular, and those hand traps are going to be Meister, which you can already see on screen. In addition to Meister, there's also Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion, Crow, and more recently being played is Ally of Justice Cycle Reader. So we're going to discuss each one and how it would be useful in the current meta matchups that are available. Firstly, we're going to be talking about Crow and how it works in the Eldlich matchup. If you're not familiar with Crow, it has a quick effect to target one card in the graveyard and banish it. That is for your opponent's graveyard. You do need to be able to discard Crow to the graveyard to activate its effect, so you can't use it under something like Macrocosmos or Dimensional Fissure, but you can use it while Shen's on the board in the Virtual World matchup. So in the Eldlich matchup, most likely you'll be trying to banish Eldlich the Golden Lord from the graveyard. Now, Golden Lord can be sitting in the graveyard quite often in those matchups. You can just target it and banish it at any time during any phase. Or you can allow your opponent to activate the effect of Golden Lord by sending one of their face-up Eldlich, one of their Eldlich spell traps, or any spell trap, matter of fact, to the graveyard, in order to add the Golden Lord back to hand. So in response to that effect, which is once per turn, which is why you might want to wait for them to activate that effect, you can target Lord with Crow. It'll get banished. They won't be able to add it back to hand or summon anything, because those effects both have to occur for that to resolve. And you'll be outing a card on your opponent's board, a spell or a trap card, but odds are they wanted it in the graveyard anyway. There's a reason they did activate the effect. So you have that use for dealing with Eldlich the Golden Lord using Crow. The other Eldlich cards that you might want to hit with Crow include Cursed Eldland. Now, there's not a lot of good moments to use Cursed Eldland, but there is at least one. When your opponent activates Eldlich the Golden Lord in graveyard, you might not care if they get Golden Lord to their hand or to the field, but if they pay cost using Eldland, Eldland will go to the graveyard first, because costs are paid when the card is activated. So Eldland will be in the graveyard before Eldlich can be added to the hand. And if you were to then activate Crow targeting Cursed Eldland in the graveyard, what would happen is that the Eldland would be banished before the chain resolves, and then Eldland wouldn't be able to activate its effect to send a Golden Land or another Eldlich to the graveyard during the next chain. That's from one of the new rules that went into effect on April 1st of 2020, although none of those rules have been officially announced in the TCG. That particular rule has been enforced at all of the remote duel extravaganzas and other events that have taken place. So I would assume that the rule in reference to cards being moved from one place to another before their activation timing has become correct, not being able to occur, is something that can still happen at this point in time. The other cards you might want to use Crow on include the Golden Land cards. That's Conquistador of the Golden Land, Guardian of the Golden Land, or Caro of the Golden Land. They're all valid targets for Crow while in the graveyard. Matter of fact, these are a lot easier to hit than the Eldlichers, and the reason for that is that the Golden Lands can only activate in the graveyard during the end phase. So if they wind up in the graveyard during your opponent's main phase or during the battle phase, you can Crow them, and they won't be able to make it to the end phase to activate their effects. Now, they are a trap card, so if you do get to the end phase and they are legal to activate, you won't be able to target them and banish them unless they've already used one of the other effects of these cards per turn, since they all summon each other. They all summon themselves as a trap monster. So if they activate the effect to summon them as a trap monster earlier in the turn and you destroy it, they won't be able to activate the effect during the end phase of that turn. So even during the end phase, that particular card will be in danger of being DD-crowed, which is why DD-crow is pretty solid against the Golden Lands. The other cards that DD-crow is pretty solid against in the Eldlich matchup include the Eldlichers. White Destiny is a quick play spell that can summon from the grave or hand, but it has the graveyard effect that you can banish it from grave, assuming you didn't activate the effect to summon Golden Lord this turn, to set a golden land. But because spell cards are inherently speed spell 1 in the graveyard, if they discard this card for Eldlich the Golden Lord, perhaps, or they send it to the grave for Eldlich the Golden Lord, they can't just chain it and quickly remove it from the graveyard to set a card. So targeting this with a DD Crow is a pretty solid hit. You prevent them from getting access to a particular golden land they want. And the same thing can be done with Eldlich or Black Awakening, also a spell card. Because it's a spell card, because it's a spell card, it's also technically speed spell 1, so your opponent can't really just chain it and get it out of the way. Additionally, if they were already used during that turn, you wouldn't have to even worry about doing that at all, because both of the effects of all 3 Eldlichs can only be used, only one of them can be used once per turn. Now, Sanguine is actually a little bit more of a pain, and the reason for Scarlet Sanguine being a little bit more of a pain than the other two is it is a trap card. So if your opponent summons Golden Lord using Eldlich or Scarlet Sanguine during one turn, during the following turn, because it's a trap card, it's speed spell 2. So no matter when you target it with DD Crow, they'll be able to chain Scarlet Sanguine and just kind of avoid being negated. Although, if you are afraid of your opponent activating the on-field effect of the Scarlet Sanguine, you could activate DD Crow targeting the Scarlet Sanguine while it's in the graveyard, in the hopes that your opponent will try to get maximum value out of it to set a golden land, where what you're really trying to do is make it so that they can't activate the on-field effect of Scarlet Sanguine. So your opponent's constantly going to be in a position where either they try and save the card in the graveyard and get value out of it, or try and make the cards on the field live. So that's one of the things you have to think about when you're trying to DD Crow these cards. So that pretty much covers everything that you would DD Crow in the Eldlich matchup. Let's move into the Drytron matchup. We're going to talk about Drytron, and we're going to talk about Virtual World. The Drytrons are a bunch of machines that can summon themselves by attributing other Drytrons with different names or ritual monsters. So and they can be summoned from, and both of these effects can be activated in the hand or in the graveyard. So if they're in the hand, you're not going to be able to stop them with DD Crow. They're just going to activate and discard. They contribute something as cost. So whatever card they tribute, so let's say we're using Alpha here, and we tribute a Delta, the Alpha will be summoned, the Delta will go to the graveyard, and then the Alpha will search the Ben 10 or try to search a ritual monster. Now, that means that they've placed another card in the graveyard for you to target, which is a target for DD Crow. You might want to DD Crow it in the open game state prior to when they activate the effect of a Drytron monster. Or you might want to wait for them to activate the effect and tribute a card as cost, both of which are perfectly valid things to do. The other thing that's kind of interesting is similar to what I was saying with Eldland before. If your opponent were to send Eldland to the graveyard using the effect of Golden Lord, you can target the Eldland so it won't be able to activate its effect in the graveyard. Same thing can be done with Ben 10. If your opponent activates the effect of a Drytron monster, and they send to the graveyard for cost the tribute of a Cyber Angel Ben 10, and you DD Crow it before the next available chain for it to activate, it will not activate, at least according to the rules being updated. Do ask your head judge at your events just in case. So DD Crow has those advantages. There is a possibility that you would be able to prevent the Dawn Knight from activating. If you're not familiar with the Drytron match, your opponent at some point will probably try to summon Union Carrier, and they're going to activate Union Carrier targeting itself to attach a Dawn Knight from their deck, and then they will usually ritual summon using Medionis Drytron to tribute the Union Carrier, because it'll have 2,000 attack, and it's a machine, so it can summon a ritual with 2,000 or less attack, usually the Ben 10 from the graveyard or Herald of Ultimateness. But it's possible that they actually use maybe we can't stop the Dawn Knight using a DD Crow with the same style of effect. I was thinking there would be a way for them to tribute the Union Carrier, which would then send a Dawn Knight to grave as a game mechanic of equipment spells. But that can't happen. You can't tribute a Union Carrier. It specifically has to be a Drytron monster, so that's just a mistake on my part. I apologize. Although, speaking of Medionis Drytron, this is an excellent target for DD Crow. Usually it's a one-of in the Drytron deck, so if you were to banish it, your opponent will be able to make any ritual summons for the rest of the game. You can lock them out of having access to Herald of Ultimateness, which is their major game plan, which is to usually ritual summon it and then just negate with all the cards in their hand. Particularly useful if your opponent's not on the Vanities ruler, because then they don't have a real end game. They'll just have maybe a couple of Herald of Orange Lights and some fairies to discard to negate stuff. But if you get rid of the Meteonis Drytron, you kind of change the game plan. So that's something to keep in mind. You can also do it in response to the activation of the effect to add it back to hand. So you can make your opponent reduce the attack of one of their Drytrons first. Could be good bait. I think that kind of covers everything you might want to DD Crow in the Drytron matchup. Let's move on to Virtual World, and then we'll talk about... speaking of, in Virtual World, hitting the monsters is actually so effective that people are playing Ally of Justice Cycle Reader, which is a DD Crow specifically for light monsters, and you can target up to 2. Not 2, meaning if they have 1, you can still target 1. So if your opponent activates a Drytron in the graveyard and discard tributes Ben-10 for cost, you can banish both of them, prevent the effect from resolving, and prevent the Ben-10 from activating, both of which are really good. Cycle Reader is actually also really good against Eldlich because he's a light monster. So if your opponent happens to have 2 Eldlich the Golden Lord in graveyard, you can potentially end the game right there, because not every Eldlich deck plays more than 2 Eldlich the Golden Lord, because he's kind of a brick. They can get to him pretty easily anyway. They want to get to him using a Cursed Eldland, just adding him to hand at the beginning of the game, or they're going to cycle through the Golden Lands into the Eldlixirs until they can get him out of the deck. Once he's in play, he's in play. So that's pretty much it for, again, the Drytron and Eldlich decks. Let's just talk about Virtual World. There's actually quite a lot of cards you can hit in the graveyard in Virtual World with DD Crow. Now, Cycle Reader doesn't work because none of the Virtual Worlds are light monsters, but you can hit their Nyan Nyan. You don't want them to try and summon it, but it will allow them to recycle a banished card. So there is a concern with giving your opponent what they want by actually banishing a Nyan Nyan. But, you know, depending on what they need, it might be a good play to do. The new Virtual World 2/2, which I'm not too familiar with, it has an effect to special summon this card as a tuner by discarding a Psychic or a Worm, so you can bring it back from grave. So you can let them discard and neg their hand one of their monsters in order to banish this one in response. Could be a solid play. You could also attempt to banish Qinglong using DD Crow. The Qinglong, they can activate in grave to search any Virtual World monster, and you don't necessarily want your opponent to ever resolve a Qinglong in the graveyard, but because DD Crow doesn't negate effects, you can't activate it in response to the effect of Qinglong from the graveyard, so you would have to activate it beforehand. And the problem with doing that is every single Virtual World monster has the opportunity to send another Virtual World card to the graveyard. So there's a possibility that if you just DD Crow Qinglong, they're just gonna activate another monster and send another one to grave, and then they can just activate that one. So this is actually one of the scenarios where DD Crow is actually pretty bad. It's not awful if you play DD Crow in your side deck, or if it's in your deck for other things and it's a better card of things you have available. You should still consider using Qinglong to deal with, DD Crow to deal with Qinglong. But just keep in mind it's probably not the best option. But, you know, determine based on the meta that you're playing with in your area, it might be better or worse, but it's not completely useless in this matchup. There's also a new trap card called Zhan Wu, I think. I've not actually read this card in person before, but it has a graveyard effect that's relevant, which is you can banish this card from the grave and target one Virtual World monster in your graveyard and special summon it with its effects negated. Then you can send one card from your hand to the graveyard. So it does target a Virtual World monster in the graveyard, so you can banish that card to avoid them getting a particular combo piece that they want. So at least it does something in that matchup. Now, Chuchi is the Virtual World card that allows them to manipulate levels, which is sometimes important for getting to True King of all Calamities, or different rank exceeds or different level synchros. Banishing this card can be helpful. You can either force them to activate it early by targeting it during the main phase while there's a monster on the board, but you can also just target it while they don't control a monster, in which case they can't activate it. Plus its graveyard effect, I believe, can only be used during the main phase, so if you use it during the draw phase or the standby phase, if they just happen to have a Chuchi already in the graveyard, there's a possibility that they won't be able to take advantage of it. I'm not saying it's the best use of this card, but it is a possible use. Next we have Virtual World Roshi or Lao. And Lalo revives a virtual world with a different name than a card you send to the graveyard with its effect. So if there's only one card in the graveyard, you can banish that target, preventing them from summoning anything using Lalo. So that's something you can do with it. Other things you might want to do is there's Shen Shen, which is the level 9 Synchro, that can come back from the graveyard turn after turn. You might not want your opponent to ever have access to this card, so banishing it while it's in the graveyard is probably a good thing to do. Also, they play a level 6, which can't be destroyed by battle or card effects depending on what's in the graveyard, so perhaps banishing one of the pieces will allow this card to be destructible. So that's another thing you can do with it. The Virtual World matchup also often goes into Cloud Castle to get a second level 9. So they use a level 9, they lower its, they make a Shen Shen to lower its level to 6, and then they synchro the Shen Shen and a level 3 tuner into a Cloud Castle to revive the Shen Shen and then make True King of All Calamities. And True King of All Calamities is the best card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now, so if we want to stop them from ever making it, we can just banish the target for the Cloud Castle, because Cloud Castle most definitely targets a card in the graveyard. So preventing them from actually making the True King of All Calamities might be the best way of dealing with it. Let's move on to the other cards. Let's talk about Skullmeister and its use. Now, Skullmeister has a similar benefit to DD Crow and Allied Justice Cycle Reader. They're all not once per turn, meaning the scenario comes up in which you use more than one, you can, which is why they're better than Belle. But Belle stops different things that these can't stop so well. Meister can negate any effect that activates in the graveyard, meaning if you start a chain in the graveyard, you can respond with Meister. So in the Eldlich matchup, that means Golden Lord's effect in the graveyard can start a chain. They'll send a spell or trap card from their field to the graveyard to activate him. It's a cost, so that's going to happen regardless. But if you want to keep him in the graveyard, you might want to Meister him. The effect of Eldland, when it goes to the graveyard, activates to send a golden land or an Eldlich the Golden Lord to the graveyard. You might not want your opponent to get access to a particular card, so you can Meister this. All of the golden lands have the ability to set an Elixir in the end phase, so they all activate at that time, and when they activate, you can Meister those. Similarly, the Elixirs all activate, and you might want to prevent them from... the Elixirs all activate, and you might want to prevent them from being able to set a particular golden land during the end phase, so or not even necessarily during the end phase, at any point in the turn, so you can negate all of those with Meister as well. So pretty much every card in the Eldlich match can be Meistered, and preventing them from getting the engine going and just going from one to the other could be good enough. Now the Drytrons can be used in hand or in the graveyard, meaning that if they activate in the hand, you can't negate them with Meister. But usually, if they, let's say I use Alpha to send Delta to grave to summon Alpha, that means that there will be a Delta activation later in the turn, which is something I can Meister and prevent from going off. Although they also might want to Alpha and use Ben 10 as cost, and then Ben 10 will activate in a new chain. You can Meister the Ben 10 trying to activate in the graveyard. You can also Meister Dawn Knight, trying to prevent them from getting a particular Drytron to graveyard, or maybe their Eva, sometimes they do. So these are all cards you might want to Meister. If Meteonis is in the graveyard, it has an effect engraved to add itself back to hand. That's something that can be Meistered. All these cards start chains. So Meister's pretty decent in this matchup. Not necessarily better than Crow, but it's good equally. I suppose DD Crow has a more permanence to it, being that the card is banished, so it's no longer in circulation to be used. So I like Crow better, but you might like Meister. In the Virtual World matchup, you can banish your opponent's Nyan Nyan. I'm sorry, you can negate the effect of your opponent's Nyan Nyan, which would leave it in the graveyard. Again, not very good. Same thing for 2/2. You can just prevent it from coming from graveyard. In a lot of cases, Crow will be better than Meister, just because it'll be a more permanent way of dealing with something. But Meister also has the ability of letting your opponent trigger these effects. So this is where Meister becomes better, in that King Long, Dunwoo, and Chuche are all once per turn. So if you were to negate these effects using Meister, your opponent has used them for the turn. They can't use them again. but Meister has no use against Lao Lao, but it can still stop Shen Shen from coming out of the graveyard, and it has no use against Cloud Castle, so they'll still be able to summon a monster. But Meister still covers quite a few of these things, which is pretty good. So you cover quite a bit of ground with Meister. Reasons to play Meister are that you're maxed out on Ghost Bells, if Ghost Bell you think is the best card to play. Let's take a look at Ghost Bell in the matchups. So unlike the other two cards, Ghost Bell has the ability to negate the activation of a card. DD Crow doesn't let them ever get to activate it because it just banishes the card. Meister allows them to activate the card and then stops the effect. Belle negates activation. So depending on the card you're negating with Belle, your opponent might be able to activate another one because a lot of cards say you can only activate this card once per turn, and Belle negates the activation, they'll be able to activate another one. But I don't think any of the cards in either of these three decks this meta have that condition, so all of these cards are use once per turn. If these cards say use once per turn, you should be able to prevent your opponent from really getting anywhere Belle, making Belle really solid in the match. Belle can also be used in the damage step because it negates activations. I'm not sure any of these cards in these decks are particularly important for that, but it is nice to know it has a little bit more reach than the other cards. But let's take a look at what you can do with Belle. You can use Belle to negate the activation of Golden Lord's effect to summon itself from the graveyard. And again, its effect to summon, to add itself to hand is a use once per turn. And I have to just scroll down here. It says you can use each effect of Eldlich the Golden Lord once per turn. Since it says use, that is a hard once per turn. It doesn't matter if you negate the activation, you can't attempt to do it again. So you can prevent Lord from getting out of the graveyard, which is okay. The effects of Eldland are not affected by Belle because it doesn't do anything that Belle would be able to stop. Same thing for Conquistador and Guardian. By the way, not a lot of people play Guardian, so it's not a card to really worry about. I think Guardian's mostly used as an out for Dragoon because it can reduce Dragoon's attack to 0. Akero of the Golden Land is a card you can Belle because the effect to summon it, if there would be a Lord on the field, would allow it to banish a card in the graveyard, and the fact that it can banish a card in the graveyard is an effect that can be negated by Belle. So in case I wasn't clear on what Belle does exactly, Belle negates any card that would banish a card from the graveyard, the activation of a card that would banish a card from the graveyard. It negates the activation of any card that would move a card from the graveyard to the hand, deck, or extra deck. So it prevents cards from being recycled. And it also negates the activation of cards that would special summon a monster from the graveyard. So Lord would be attempting to special summon, it wouldn't be attempting to special summon itself from the graveyard. It's adding itself to hand, which is why you can Belle it. Akero has the potential to banish a card from the graveyard, which is another one of the targets. Elixir of White Destiny can potentially summon a Lord from the hand or the graveyard. And the fact that it can potentially banish, can summon from graveyard means that White Destiny is a target for Ghost Bell. Even if the Lord was in the hand at the time and there's no Lord in graveyard, there's nothing that says you can't Twin Twister and put the Lord in the graveyard in response, and then it would still bring it out. It doesn't target. It didn't need to be a valid Lord in graveyard to activate the card. So you can Belle White Destiny. Similarly, you can Belle Scarlet Sanguine because it can summon from hand or deck or graveyard, because graveyard's one of the choices. It kind of lets you use Belle like an Ash Blossom in the sense of Scarlet Sanguine. So if you already play 3 Ash, Belle allows you to have kind of more Ashes, which is useful. It's also good against things like Nadir Servant and Cyphering Gear Gamma, both of which can get cards from the graveyard. Now, I didn't realize this for a long time, that Nadir Servant says add a Dogmatica monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand by sending a card from the extra deck to the graveyard. So the fact that you can do a card in the graveyard, even though no one ever really does, unless they're just playing like one Ecclesia and they're trying to recycle it. But again, it lets you kind of use Belle like an Ash in that case. It also works on Gamma because the Cyphering driver can be summoned from the deck or the graveyard. So you can Ash or Belle either of those cards. Onto the Drytrons, you can Belle the Drytrons in the graveyard because they all attempt to summon a monster from the graveyard. But if they're in the hand, you can't, with the exception of Drytron Gamma, because its effect includes the ability to special summon a Drytron from the graveyard. So this one you can always Belle. So if your opponent activates them, they still pay costs. So they still put cards in the graveyard. The cards are still tributed. So if they tributed a Ben 10, it would still activate or be able to activate in the next chain. But you are able to Belle these cards. You can Belle the effect of Meteonis Drytron, so you can prevent them from adding it back to hand, because Belle negates any card that can negate any card that would try to add something back to the hand. You can negate in the Virtual World matchup Nyan Nyan, 2/2, Zhan Wu, because they all can special summon a monster from the graveyard. You can actually use Belle to negate the activation of Lao Lao to summon itself from the hand, because it could potentially summon a card from the graveyard. You should also be able to use it on Gigi, because Gigi attempts to add a card from the graveyard back to the hand during the end phase. So both of those should be Belleable. I'm actually not 100% sure on Gigi. Mostly pretty sure that you can use it on Gigi. The other big cards to use it on in the Virtual World match include Shen Shen, which tries to special summon itself from the graveyard, and Cloud Castle, attempting to summon something from the graveyard. So against the Cloud Castle, a Belle is almost like an Effect Veiler, which isn't bad. And yeah, I think that kind of covers everything in the meta that you can really use these cards on. I'm sure other things come up. If you enjoyed this series, let me know, and maybe we'll do more in the future. Make sure you subscribe to see more episodes of meta tips for lazy duelists. Comment, subscribe, check the Discord link in the description. Maybe follow us on Twitch, and I'll see you guys next time.